Drawing a mermaid is easier than you think, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it, no matter your skill level. Hello wonderful people, it's Genevieve, and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the weekly videos, and so that you can join our wonderful creative community. And with that said, grab your drawing tools, and let's get started. Now this month is MerMay, which is a design or illustration challenge, I should say, in which every day has a different prompt to draw a mermaid. So I thought it could be fun to do a tutorial on how to draw a pretty basic mermaid that you can then customize if you're doing the challenge for every single prompt. Or of course, if you're not participating in MerMay, you could just draw this mermaid along with me, and that's totally fine as well. Now a few things before we get started. In this video, I'm going to be drawing on an app called Procreate on the iPad Pro, but I'm not going to use any fancy technique. We're just going to be drawing, so you can follow along with any software of your choice. That being said, if you are using Procreate and if you want to have my illustration as a reference right here, the way to do that is go in the wrench icon menu at the top and the canvas submenu, activating reference toggle here, which is going to let you import an image. Now if you want to download my illustration along with the color palette that we're going to use in this video, they will both be linked in the description below and they're totally free. We're going to start by just roughly sketching the general shape of the mermaid. So for that, we're going to create a new layer, and we're going to rename this layer to Sketch. And here you can really sketch with any color of your choice. I like to just sketch with a neutral gray, but it doesn't matter. We're not going to see the sketch in the final result, so whatever you want to use is totally fine. And in terms of brushes here in this video, I'm always going to suggest a few different options. I'm going to suggest free brushes that come with Procreate that you can totally use and get really good results. I'm also going to suggest just general things that you might want to look for if you're using a different software to find brushes that might work well and that could be comparable with the Procreate brushes. And I'm also going to be suggesting brushes that come from my Ultimate Illustration bundle. Now these brushes are absolutely not essential. You can of course follow along with whatever you have. Even pencil and paper could work, honestly. But the illustration brushes can help you save time and get more professional result because they have a lot of texture and they're super sensitive to the Apple Pencil. So it's just a great option if you're looking to push your art further a little bit and get, more professional results. Now these brushes, if you do want to check them out, again, they're not essential, but they will be linked in the description below, and there's a special promo code for the YouTube people. So for the sketch, honestly, again, we're not going to see it in the final result, so the brush really doesn't matter. Just pick something that you know you're comfortable with. In Procreate, in terms of free brushes, that could be in the sketching pack that comes with the app, the HB pencil. If you're working in a different software, anything that has pencil in the name could probably work really, really well. And if you have the illustration bundle, you could pick the sketching brush, of course. So you're going to start by just loosely mapping which shape you want your mermaid to be. So just the main line of movement. In my case, I have this kind of inverted S-curve, almost like a hook, but it could be totally different for you, of course. And at the top of this line, we're going to map out the head really roughly with just a basic circle. From there, we're going to add a trapeze for the chest, and then another one for the pelvis, which is going to later extend into the tail. Now you can totally position the arms of your mermaid however you want. I think it's really cool if your mermaid is underwater, trying to have the arms be really, really flowy, like in my example. But no matter what position you want your arms to be in, for now we're just going to draw the different segments with basic lines. So essentially kind of like if you were drawing a stick figure. So I'm going to have mine again be super flowy, kind of like this. And you can map out the hand as well. Really just focusing on the movement and the general proportions. You can also map out the neck. And then move on to the tail. Now the tail, you have so many different options that you can use. You could go with a super thick tail with kind of fluffy end. That's not really fluffy, but you see what I mean. Or you could go with a more traditional end, which I have in my example. So here you can really experiment with different shapes, but essentially the idea is going to be the same. You're going to start from the hips or like the bottom of this trapeze and then thicken it a little bit and then narrow it down to the end. And it's okay at this stage if the sketch is messy. You can have a bunch of lines. That's totally okay. In the next phase, in the next step of this video, we're going to clean it up. So for now, just draw a bunch of lines. Don't worry about erasing. That's really not necessary for now. So once you have the general structure, you always have the option to just move the different basic shapes that we have around and change the proportions a little bit. For example, I feel like my arm here might be a little bit too short, so I'm just going to use a selection tool. In Procreate, it's right here at the top, but it's available in most software. I'm going to set it to freehand, and then I'm just going to draw a selection around the arm. And then using the arrow tool, or any tool that allows you to resize stuff and move it around, I'm going to indeed resize the arm. You could also rotate and just play with the different body parts until you're happy with the basic structure. So feel free to pause the video here and move stuff around until, yes, you're happy with the skeleton. And then I'm going to show you really quickly, before moving on to the next steps, how to refine the different body parts like the arms and the head. So the arms are pretty easy. You're just going to go ahead and draw ovals around the different segments that you have. And for the hands, I'm not going to go in super intense details on how to draw hands because it's a bit advanced and I have a separate video about that. So if you want to check it out, I will link in the description below. But for now, just kind of focus again on the movement. So you can just quickly map out fingers. It really doesn't have to be super precise. And then you can thicken them up again, just kind of like we did for the arms. So just drawing ovals around the basic segments. Now for the head, if you've watched any of my other tutorials, you know what I'm about to say. We're going to start by drawing what I call the plus sign, which is just a slightly curved vertical line and a slightly curved horizontal line that are going to help us visualize the direction of the head, which is going to make it much easier to map out the different facial features. At this stage, you could also refine the shape of the head itself. I'm not a fan of having it be super curvy. I like to have more of a bean shape, so you could totally do that as well. And then you can simply go in and quickly map out the facial features. Now, I like to have the eyes and the nose on the same line. That's obviously not realistic. Usually the nose would be around here, but I like putting mine quite high. And then you can draw the eyes somewhere along the horizontal line itself. Other thing that I personally like to do, which is definitely not realistic, but I like to have the mouth on one side, so you could have it in the middle if you want, but I'm going to go ahead and put it to the side like I usually do. You can also quickly map out where your eyebrows are going to be, and then we're going to move on to the hair. Now the hair here, you have so many different things you can do. If your mermaid is underwater, you can really play a lot with the hair and kind of make it float like I have in my example. Now just like the hands, I have a bunch of videos that you can use if you want to learn how to draw a specific hairstyle. I have short hair, I have curly hair, and I have just kind of a bunch of different characters with different hairstyles. So I will link those videos in the description below if you want a really in-depth explanation. But otherwise, I do have a few tips for drawing hair that I'm going to share in this video. I personally like to start by mapping out the hair around the face, so how it's framing the face. So usually I have one strand that is framing the forehead, and then another one that is going to be framing the cheek on the other side. Then from there, I like to map out the hair that is close to the top of the head. Kind of like this. And then from there, it's just a case of drawing the general shapes. So you don't want to think of the hair as individual strands, for now at least. You want to think of it almost like a super flexible cloth or towel drape on the top of your character. Now, since my character is underwater here, I kind of want the hair to float upwards at the end. And I also want it to be wavy, so the hair kind of feels like water itself. And again, at this stage, it doesn't need to look good. It can be super, super messy. Draw a lot of line, draw the movement. Don't worry about making it look good. That's what we're going to do in the next step. Speaking of which, take all the time you need here to work on your rough sketch. Feel free to go back in with your selection tool to move stuff around. And once you're happy with the general structure, we're going to move on to the next step, which is going to be a combination of cleaning up the sketch and creating a clean outline. Great, so once you have your basic structure, honestly the next few steps are pretty easy because we're simply going to be tracing and then using the outlines like you would in a coloring book. So we're going to start by drawing some sort of line art. So you can go ahead and create a new layer and rename this new layer to line art. And at this stage, I recommend lowering the opacity of your sketch because otherwise it's going to be a bit hard to know what to draw. So usually I would lower mine until I can just barely see it, but I want you to be able to see it in the video, so I'm going to leave it quite opaque, probably around 40%. But in case, really lower the opacity as much as you can before you just cannot see anything. And for the line art, you could go ahead and have just a pure black line art everywhere. But I personally like my line art to be just darker versions of the different colors I have in my illustration. But if you're like me, when you start an illustration, when you're at the sketching phase, you don't necessarily know which colors you're going to use. So for now, we're just going to pick really any color of our choice, and later in the video, I'm going to show you how to recolor your line art really easily so that it matches the rest of the colors in your illustration. That being said, if you are working with my color palette, we kind of already know what we're going to use. So we're going to pick this color right here, which is going to be the darker version of the skin. But again, if you don't know what you're about to do, or if you're not working with my color palette, just pick any color, it doesn't matter. I'm going to show you how to recolor everything later. In terms of brushes here, you could totally stick with whatever you're using for the sketch, or if you're working with Procreate, in terms of free brushes, you could stick with the sketching pack but switch to the 6B pencil instead of the HB pencil. Or if you're working with my illustration bundle, you could pick the Outlines brush. Now these brushes have a bit of texture and grit to them, which I personally like a lot in my illustrations, but if you're not a fan, you could totally go with more of an inking, smooth brush. It's just a question of experimenting here. Once more, similarly to the sketch, just pick something you know you're happy with, or just go with whatever I'm suggesting. And at this stage, really, all we're going to do is trace over the lines that we have. So finding the one we want to use in the final illustration and just tracing over it. Now there's really no right or wrong way to do this, but I do have a few tips for you. The first one being, since we're working digitally, taking advantage of the undo option. So if you're drawing a curve, for example, in the tail, and you realize you're not happy with a part of the curve, instead of erasing that part, just undo the whole thing and redraw your curve. That way you're going to get much smoother curves, much smoother lines in your illustration, and the flow of your illustration overall is going to be much better. Believe it or not, you're also going to save time. Probably not the first few illustrations you do that way, but over time, as you get used to it, it's going to be much faster to just undo instead of erasing and redrawing until you're happy with your curves. So take all the time you need here to go over your different lines to draw your line art. I'm going to stop talking to let you focus on that, but I'm going to keep my video in the background so you can use it as an example. And we're going to meet up once we have traced everything. I'm going to show you a few details that you might want to add, like the shells on the breast and other things like that. So once you've drawn the general outlines, I guess, we're also going to draw some details and other elements that would require some sort of line art. And for that, it might be helpful to hide the sketch just so you can really have a clear idea of what you're working with. Now, the first thing we'll probably want to do is add some sort of a cover for the chest, depending on what kind of mermaid you're drawing, of course. I'm going to go with the super classic shells, but this is something that could be really cool to customize based on the different prompts if you're doing mermaid. But if you want to draw shells, it's pretty simple. You could start with just this base of a trapeze and then drawing the very classic shell shape at the top. Now on this layer, you might also want to draw stuff like the collarbones, so just two very simple lines. A belly button, maybe some scales on the tail. I personally just like to draw a few, just to kind of show that there are scales, but without having to draw the entire texture. So just a few little clusters here and there. Depending on the kind of tail end that you have, you might want to have a little bit of texture in there as well. I'm gonna go with just simple lines. And you can also add some more movement in the hair. So again, without necessarily focusing on individual strands, just add a few more lines to show really the movement and break it up a little bit without again having to go in and draw every single little individual hair. And at this stage, you might have noticed I usually don't draw anything in the inside of the eyes. I'm going to show you my favorite technique for drawing eyes later in the video. So you could totally leave them blank like I do, or you could sketch them in if you want. So now that we have our line art, essentially it's like we're working with a coloring book. So the next few steps are going to be quite easy. And here you could use any color palette of your choice. It's probably going to depend, again, if you're doing Mermaid, the color palette is going to depend on the prompt. Now I built a pretty simple one here that you can use for sure. But I'm going to give you a few tips if you want to use your own colors. And the first thing I personally like to do is figuring out which skin tone I want to use. I'm going with a fair skin similar to mine, but you could really experiment with whatever. You could even go with like a blue skin, that could be super fun. So again, in the color palette, it's going to be this one right here, but you can use whatever you want. And we're going to draw all the different colors on separate layers. So we're going to create a new layer below the line art, and we're going to rename it to skin. And here the brush doesn't matter too much, you just want to find something that doesn't have too much texture to it. So it could be, for example, if you're working with free Procreate brushes in the airbrushing pack, the hard brush, making sure that if you watch my watercolor videos, you lift up the opacity back to 100%. If you're working in a different software, just find any kind of hard brush that is a circle and doesn't have any texture to it. It's usually the most basic brush. But if you're working with the illustration bundle, you could go ahead and pick the base round brush. And here we're just going to outline the shape that is going to be skin color, and then we're going to fill it in to create a silhouette. And once you have your outline, you can just fill it in. Now you can move on to any color you want next, but I would recommend going on with the tail because it's pretty important in the piece. So just creating a new layer once more, renaming it to tail. And here you're just going to pick any color that you think you might want to go with. It really doesn't need to be exact, just something in that range. If you're working with the color palette, I know the one I'm going to use is this one right here, but seriously, you could pick anything. And we're just going to repeat the same steps, so outlining the shape and then fill it in to create a solid silhouette. Now once you have your silhouette, since it is on a separate layer, you could go ahead and use tools like in Procreate in the adjustment panel, hue, saturation, and brightness. You could also use color balance, gradient map. Any tool, no matter which software you're using, any tool that allows you to play with the color, you could use those. I'm going to go with hue, saturation, and brightness. And then you can just play with the different settings and just kind of see which color you like the most. And you can do that for every single element. Now I know I want to use this color for the tail, so I'm going to keep it as is. But pick any color of your choice and then move on to the next color and repeat the same step. And then that way you're going to be able to use your intuition to build a color palette that you know works well because you can tweak the colors instead of having to build a color palette beforehand and kind of using your brain instead of your eyes and your gut. So personally, I'm going to move on to the hair next. So I'm just going to create a new layer and rename it to hair, but you could go with the end of the tail or the shells or anything. Now for the hair, if you're using the color palette, it's going to be this blue right here. But otherwise, again, pick any color of your choice and you can always change it using any kind of layer color adjustment that you have available in your software. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this final video, please go ahead and leave me a comment below with which color you're using for your mermaid's tail. Now, if you're new on the channel, you might be a little bit confused with what is this secret password thing. It's a game that we play in all of the illustration videos. I hide a secret password for you to find, and it does a few things. It's really fun for me because you guys know me, you see my face in the intro, you hear my voice throughout the entire video, but I have no idea who you guys are. And whenever you leave a comment, no matter what the comment is, I get to sometimes see your face, sometimes see your name, and it's just really, really great to see who's part of the creative community that we're building here on this channel. So that's one thing, but the secret password also gives me a lot of insight into how to edit and pace my videos better, which helps me create better tutorials for you guys, and that's super, super important. So yeah, just leave a comment with whichever color your tail is, and then we're going to keep going. Now again, I know this is the blue I'm going to use, but just to show you an example, if I was to go back in my adjustment panel, picking hue, saturation, brightness, I could just play with the hue and see if there's a different color that I like. Pink could be cool, like this super bright, that looks like Ariel, but but you see the idea. That way you can really build a color palette as you go. So we're just going to repeat this step with all the different elements we have. Now I personally want the shells and the end of the tail to be the same color, so I'm just going to create one layer for both of them. And I'm going to rename this layer to light blue. And since the shells are above the body, I'm going to make sure that this layer is at the top of the list but below the line art, so that way the skin is not going to hide the shells. And if you're using the color palette, the shells and the end of the tail is going to be this super light blue here. It's almost white, but not quite. So feel free to repeat this step a bunch of times if you need to, if you have more elements than I do. Otherwise, we're going to move on to the eyes. So for the eyes, we're going to create a new layer. We're going to put it right below the line art, so above everything else. And we're going to rename it to eyes. Now for the eyes, you're going to pick a super, super light color, like a light gray that is almost white, but not quite, so that we can later add an extra highlight in the eye. And we're going to repeat the same step, so just outlining the shape and then filling it in. And if you want here, you could totally go ahead and just draw the pupil on the same layer. But like I told you, I personally like to use a special little trick. So if you want to follow along, you can create a new layer. Rename this new layer to iris. And we're going to apply this iris layer as a clipping mask on the eyes. So in Procreate, you can just tap on the layer and then select a clipping mask in the list. Now, clipping masks are really quite common, so most digital art software are going to have a clipping mask option. And essentially what a clipping mask does is now everything we draw on this iris layer is going to stay within the eye shape. So you can pick whatever color you want for your eyes. If you're using the color palette, it's going to be this purple right here. And you're just going to draw a circle for the iris. And drawing eyes can be really tricky because the positioning of the iris can really make or break your character. But the beauty of drawing it on a separate layer that is a clipping mask on the eyes means that you can, with the iris layer selected, use the selection tool, select one or both of the iris, and with the arrow tool you can then just very quickly and easily move the direction your character is looking in. You can also resize the irises if they're not the same size. So that's a really easy way and super intuitive way of drawing eyes. And when you draw the iris, you might notice that the positioning of one eye, like the entire eye, is not exactly how you want it to be. So in that case, if that happened to you, all you have to do is select the line art layer because we have the eyelashes, the iris and the eyes layer. So in Procreate, you just swipe all the layers you want to select towards the right. And then going back with the selection tool of your choice to draw a selection around the eye. And with the arrow tool, you should be able to move all the layers. Now, don't be scared here. If you have a clipping mask, when you are with the arrow tool, the clipping mask is just going to disappear. But if you exit, it's going to come back. And I'm going to show you how to add some color variation, like in the hair and in the skin. But before that, we're going to really quickly map out the background. So for the background, you can obviously use any color of your choice, again, depending on the context you want your mermaid to be in. Here, I'm just going to draw a super simple, dark, kind of watery background. Now, if you're working in Procreate, you're simply going to start by changing your background color to a dark blue. If you're working with the color palette, you're going to pick this one right here. And then on top of this background layer, so below everything that is related to your character, you're going to create a new layer. And you're going to rename it to water or water shape, something like that. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. As long as you rename it to remember what it is, that's enough. And then you're going to pick a lighter version of your blue. So in my case, in the color palette, it's this one right here. Then all you have to do is draw some super organic shape wherever you want them to be, just to break up the background, make it feel a little bit more fun, and make it look like water. We could also add a bit of a light at the top to create some sort of gradient. So for that, we're going to create a new layer above the water shape. And we're going to rename it to water light. Again, doesn't really matter. As long as you rename it, you're totally fine. And here we're going to use a blending mode. So if you're working in Procreate, just tapping on the N next to the check mark, and we're going to select a blending mode called Add. And what Add is going to do, without getting into all the details about blending mode, this is another case where I have a video where I really go in depth about blending modes. So I will link that video in the description below if you want to check it out. But essentially for now, just keep in mind that if you apply blending mode on a layer, the colors on that layer are going to blend with the colors below and kind of adapt to them. So it's going to change depending on what is underneath. So that's super helpful for drawing shadows and lights. In our case here, we just have a basic light, but we're going to use these blending modes later when we start shading the character. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. That being said though, Add is very, very strong. So you probably want to lower the opacity of your layer a little bit, probably around 50 for now. And then we're going to draw the shape, and then we're going to come back and play with the opacity. And we're going to stick with the same light blue, and you're just going to draw a semi-circle or oval. It really doesn't need to be precise at the top. You're going to fill it in, and then we're going to blur it so that it kind of fades in and it looks less like this crazy shape and more like a gradient. Most software will have something called Gaussian blur. In Procreate, it is in the adjustment panel here at the top. Right here, you can pick Gaussian blur. And you can add and take out blur by just moving your finger from one side to the other. And once you have your blur, you can go back to the layer opacity and pick what opacity you want. I'm probably going to keep mine pretty opaque actually. I do want a lot of light. I just feel like it makes the background so much more fun. And speaking of making the background more fun, we're going to finish up this background by adding some little bubbles. And I say background, but honestly, some of the bubbles are above the mermaid, so it's not really background, but we're still going to do it at this step. Otherwise, I know I'm going to forget to do it later. But since they're above the mermaid, you want to make sure that you create a new layer above everything, even above the line art. So just new layer, renaming it to bubbles. And for the bubbles, you can use any color of your choice. I'm personally going to pick the same one that I used for the bottom of the tails and the shells, so a super, super light blue. And here you're going to go back to whichever brush you used for your outlines. So that could be if you're working with free brushes from Procreate, the 6B pencil and the sketching pack, or if you're working with the illustration bundle, the outlines brush. And all you're going to do is draw a bunch of little circles with varying sizes around your character. And the bubbles are a really great occasion to just play with blending modes if you're not familiar with them, and just see if there's one that you like and would kind of enhance the look of the bubbles. So you can really just go through the list and see if there's one that you like, and that way you can start to see what the different blending modes do without necessarily needing to know the theory behind them. So really just kind of scrolling and just seeing if there's something that you like. I'm probably going to go with Add again, honestly, or Color Dodge. No, I'm going to go with Color Dodge, and you can also play with the opacity if you feel like it's too intense. Really, here it's a question of experimenting and seeing if there's something that you like. Now we're almost ready to start shading, but before that I want to show you how you can add color variation in your character, because right now it's a little bit flat and it could be so much more fun very, very easily. Now, I personally like to add color variation on the skin and in the hair, but you can use the 2 tips I'm going to give you for anything else that you might have in your illustration. So the first step is going to be simply creating a clipping mask, just like we did for the eyes, but on top of the skin, or again, any other elements. You can rename it to whatever you want. I'm going to rename it to pink because I know it's going to be for a pink color. And yeah, just applying it as a clipping mask so that now whatever we draw on this new layer is going to stay within the shape of the skin. So from there you can go and pick any color you want to use for your color variation. Again, here I'm going to go with some sort of salmony pink to kind of add a little bit more life to my character, mostly on the cheeks and stuff like that. And once more, there are a few different brushes you could use at this stage. If you're working with free Procreate brushes, you could stick with the 6B pencil, that could work well. You could also experiment with the different brushes from the charcoal pack. I personally really like the willow charcoal, but they could all work really well. It depends on the vibe that you want to have. But if you're working with the illustration brushes, I recommend going with the basic texture brush. And then you can just really quickly go over different parts and brush your color to just, again, add some more color variation and bring your character to life. I personally like to add some pink, yes, on the cheeks and the nose, but also on the shoulders, the elbows, and the end of the fingers. If your mermaid is in water, you might also want to add some blue on the skin. So same thing, just creating a new layer. This time we're going to rename it to blue. We're also going to apply it as a clipping mask and with the same brush, but this time with some sort of blue. No matter which one, I'm going to go with the one that I use for the shells and the tail. Just brushing over a few parts of the skin, doesn't really matter which ones, but this is going to help your character kind of blend with the environment. Now this is one really cool way to add color variation. There's another one that is even quicker, and I'm going to use it on the hair to add some sort of gradient within the hair. So for that we're going to select the hair layer, but again you could use it on any other element. It could look really cool in the tail as well, by the way. But selecting your layer, and then with the selection tool, setting it to freehand and making sure that the color fill option is deactivated if you're working in Procreate. That's super important. You're going to select either the bottom or the top of the hair. I'm going to go with the bottom. And then you're going to feather your selection. Now the feathering amount is going to depend on a bunch of things like the size of your canvas, as well as the length of the hair and stuff like that. But you can just kind of experiment and see. It's going to be really hard to see on my screen, but if you're following along, you're going to be able to see that your selection is kind of fading. So you can just kind of play with that until it seems good to you. It's kind of a question of feeling, and you can always go back and experiment with it. I'm probably going to go with something around 30. And then you can just go back to any color adjustment tool that you have. So if you're working in Procreate, I recommend using in the adjustment panel the hue, saturation, and brightness. And then simply by playing with the sliders, you can create a very cool gradient in your color. So take all the time you need here to add as much or as little color variation as you want, and then we're going to move on to the next step. I'm going to show you how to recolor your outlines, and finally I'm going to show you how to shade everything. Now, recoloring your outline is totally optional. You could just have one color if you want, but having slightly different color outline I think is a really good way of making your illustration look more polished and more professional, and it's really quite quick. Now the hack I like to use is using what is called Alpha Lock on my line art layer. If you're working with Procreate, you can activate Alpha Lock by swiping your layer towards the right with 2 fingers. You could also activate it by just tapping on the layer and just selecting Alpha Lock in the menu. And again, without getting into all the technical details of Alpha Lock, what it does is now everything you draw on your line art layer is going to stay within the line art that is already there, which means you can just go ahead and pick a darker version of, for example, the tail. If you're working in the color palette, it's on the right of the main color, so right here. And then you can just quickly brush over to recolor the outlines. If you cannot find Alpha Lock in your software, that's okay. You could either redraw over the outlines manually, that's kind of annoying, I know, or you could use the selection tool technique that we use to add color variation. So for example, I would go ahead and just select the outline around the tail, and then again going back with any color adjustment layer tool that you have, like hue, saturation, brightness, or color balance, and play with the color of the outline until it matches what is inside the lines. So once more, I'm going to stop talking here to let you focus on recoloring your outlines. It should just take a few seconds. And once you're done, feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter in the video, in which we're going to shade our character to really make it pop and make this illustration look super good. Great, so we're almost done. We only need to add some lights and shadows to really make this pop. Right now it's kind of bland and a little bit boring, to be honest. And we're not going to draw super realistic, fancy shadows. We're mostly going to accentuate different elements, mostly the hair, and then differentiate different body parts that right now look like they're kind of bunched together. And we're going to start, usually I start with the shadows, but here we're going to start with the lights. And for that, we're going to create a new layer. We're going to put it right below the line art, so above all the different color layers we have, but below the line art. And if you're working in Procreate and if you use a clipping mask on your iris, you might notice that this new layer is automatically going to get applied as a clipping mask. You don't want that, so make sure if it's the case, you just deactivate clipping mask here. And then you're going to rename this layer to lights. And just like we did for the light in the background, we're going to set the blending mode of this light layer to add. And we're going to lower the opacity quite a lot, probably around 30% for now, but we can always come back and play with it later for sure. And here we're going to pick any color you want your lights to be. So in my case, my mermaid is underwater, so my lights are probably going to be kind of bluish. If your mermaid was outside in the sun, you might want to go with highlights that are kind of super light yellow. But again, in my case, my mermaid is underwater, so I'm just going to pick the same super light blue that I use for the shells and the end of the tail. And here there are so many different ways of adding lights. I personally kind of have this technique that I called outlining your outlines. So that technique is super easy, but it really is going to make everything pop. You essentially just figure out where your light source is going to be. My character is underwater, so I can imagine the sun would be coming from above. So all you have to do is just look at every different body parts or every element and outline any section that is facing the light source. So in my case, any element that is facing the top. So if we look at the shells here, it would just mean outlining like this. So pick a light source, no matter where it is, that's totally okay. And then just go over your entire character and outline your outlines in light when they're facing the light source. Oh, and one thing I always do in my illustrations is add extra highlights on the cheeks. I know it's not outlining any outline, but I think it makes it just so much cuter, so I always do that. And you can also add some extra highlights in the hair, so not necessarily following specific lines, but just adding some movement with your lights as well. But otherwise, very simple, just outlining any outline that is facing the top or wherever your light source is. And if you have any parts that are shiny, like for example the tail, you can even go in with a super large version of your brush and just brush over and do a bigger line, so not necessarily outlining your outline, but just adding a bunch of light, just to again make it pop a little bit more. Now once you're done mapping out everything, you can always go back and play with the opacity. I feel like mine are a little bit too intense, so I'm going to lower the opacity once more. Now you can move on straight to the shadows if you want, but I like to add some extra highlights in the hair because they're wet, they're underwater, they should be like glistening and super fun. But for those lights, we're going to go right above the hair layer. Going to create a new layer, renaming it to hair lights. We're going to apply it as a clipping mask so it stays within the hair shape. Now if you don't have clipping masks in your software, that's okay. You're just going to need to be a little bit more precise with your lines so that you don't go outside of the hair shape or just erase after you're done, so it really doesn't matter that much. And we're also going to set the blending mode to add, and you can lower the opacity to roughly what you set for the other light layer. And then what I personally like to do, you could do something else if you want, or you could just skip this altogether again and move on straight to the shadows. But I like to go in and add some stripes across the hair. So this is the hair direction, kind of like this. So I would add lines like this. You can see it's really simple, it's not realistic, but it does add a lot of volume to the hair. And if you do this all over the place, it's going to make it look like the hair is super shiny, flowy, and it's going to really accentuate that water vibe that we've got going on. And it really doesn't have to be precise. You can just add a few here and there, maybe spend a minute or two on this. And then final step, we're going to move on to the final step, which is going to be adding the shadows. Now, like I said, the shadows here, I'm going to keep them very simple, even more simple than the lights. So we're just going to go ahead and create a new layer below the line art and below the lights, but above everything else. Once more, it might automatically apply as a clipping mask, so make sure you release that clipping mask if it's the case for you as well. Then we're going to rename the layer to shadows. And for the shadows, we're going to use the blending mode linear burn. It's almost the opposite of add, so instead of making your colors brighter and look like light, it's going to make your colors darker and look like shadows. But it's also pretty strong, so we're going to lower it for now, probably around 40%, but we can always come back and play with it later. Now your shadows are also going to depend on the environment around your mermaid. Mine, again, water, so I'm going to go with blue shadows. And I'm going to pick the same blue that I use for the base of the hair. And the shadows here, I'm personally only going to use them whenever I have different elements that are overlapping to help them separate. So for example, the hair here is overlapping the body, so I'm just going to add a very quick shadow under the hair and onto the shoulder. Same thing with the shell and this kind of corner, the armpit, I guess. You could add a shadow there. The part of the hair that is behind the body, we're definitely going to shade that. You can also add some shadows between the different hair section to add a lot of volume there. And as you can see, it's really not something super precise, but it's going to help add so much more depth in your character, and your illustration is really going to pop a whole lot more just by adding a few shadows here and there. Oh, and one last little thing to do, I almost forgot, but it's going to make such a big difference, is adding some shading and some lights in the eyes. So we're going to create a new layer for the shadows, and this one we actually want it to be a clipping mask onto the eye. So we're just going to quickly apply that. And then we're going to rename this layer to eye shadows. We're going to use the same blending mode, so linear burn, and you're going to set it to roughly what it was for the rest of the shadows, in my case around 30 or 40. And then you're going to add a shadow on the top of the eye. I know it's probably sounds weird, but you're going to see it's really going to make your eyes pop a lot more. And to really bring your character to life, you're also going to add some highlights in the eye. So again, creating a new layer. Rename this layer to highlights. Applying it as a clipping mask onto the base eye shape. Here we don't need to change the blending mode because we're just going to go with pure white. And then you can just add a bit of a highlight in the eye, which as you can see makes a world of difference. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn how to draw an animal friend for your mermaid, I highly recommend you check out this playlist because I have a bunch of animal illustration tutorials that you might like. But before you leave, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos. Then click on the link right here and I'll meet you there.